I did join Hizb ut-Tahrir at 16 years old, 16 years of age. I moved to London to recruit for Hizb ut-Tahrir. I joined Newham College, where I was elected as president of the Students' Union. And regrettably and sadly, due to the radicalization that occurred on that campus, myself and Ed Hussein were both on the campus of Newham College, Ed Hussein being the author of the widely acclaimed book, The Islamist. Sadly, that radicalization eventually led to a situation where another student was murdered on campus by somebody who was a supporter of our activities. And really that should have acted as a warning for me in those early days, because what played out in Newham College ended up being the microcosm of what would play itself out much, much later on with the attacks on the 11th of September in the United States of America. And that is that people who were inspired by our ideology, Hizb ut-Tahrir's ideology, but merely differed with us in tactics, decided to use that very same ideology to bring about violence and chaos in this world. Ed Hussein, when he saw the murder on Newham College, decided to leave Hizb ut-Tahrir. I very foolishly decided to stay, thinking that perhaps we could carry on with our very intellectual mission rather than focusing on encouraging anyone who's violent to support us. But I didn't realize that the problem was not in necessarily the associations we made of people who were naturally inclined to violence, but the problem was in the very ideas themselves. I went on to, as you mentioned, export Hizb ut-Tahrir to Pakistan from London and also to Denmark from London. I also know personally, by personal experience, that Hizb ut-Tahrir was exported from London to many other countries, including Indonesia and Malaysia. Europe generally acts as a diplomatic hub, a funding source, and a media platform for Islamist radicals, whether they be of the terrorist type or whether they be of the revolutionary or radical type. I ended up, as you mentioned, in Egypt, where I was convicted to 5 years in prison for being a member of Hizb ut-Tahrir, after taking a route via their torture dungeons in the headquarters of the state security, whereby people were electrocuted before my eyes for being associated with us. I was thankfully adopted by Amnesty International as a prisoner of conscience, and that was the first step for me, for my heart to open up. For the first time in 10 years after having joined Hizb ut-Tahrir, I began to think of a non-Muslim in a way different to how I had been speaking and thinking about non-Muslims. Because Amnesty International extended their hand to me, despite the fact that I had been propagating that Amnesty and other such human rights organizations were in fact the enemy to Islam and Muslims. And as you mentioned, I left prison in 2006, returned to the UK, and after having joined the leadership committee of Hizb ut-Tahrir, finally decided that I could no longer carry on with the hypocrisy that I felt inside me, because I no longer believed in the Islamist ideology, and so I resigned. Now what I'd like to very quickly address is what I believe is the way to differentiate between Islamists and normal, ordinary Muslims. And through my experience and my work and the work we're doing in the Quilliam Foundation and also my academic studies, I went on to study a Masters in Political Theory with modules in terrorism, conflict and violence, modules in multiculturalism, modules in religion and politics. That's the London School of Economics. And I believe that we're able to identify 4 core elements that Islamists will share regardless of the tactics that they employ to bring about that ideology. And I wish to discuss briefly about those 4 core elements and then the different strands of Islamists who adhere to those 4 core principles and how they differ in their tactics. And then if there is time, I'm very conscious I have to adhere to the 10 minutes, just to mention something about the role that grievances play in radicalization vis-a-vis ideology itself. So first of all, the 4 core elements that I think are common to all Islamists, regardless of the methodology they employ. And the first one I identify is that Islamists believe that Islam is a political ideology rather than a religion. Now, traditionally, Muslims would believe that their faith is a religion. But Islamists insist, beginning from the 1920s with Hassan al-Banna, that Islam is in fact a political ideology. Now, the roots of that perhaps can come out later, but just very quickly, that's traced through the influence of communism in the Arab world, especially through the Arab socialism known as Baathism. A lot of the founding members of Islamists were inspired by Baathists, Arab socialists, including the founder of Hizb ut-Tahrir, who used to be a Baathist. So the first point there, the implication of Islam being a political ideology rather than a religion, is that that means there must be a perennial conflict between Islam and capitalism, just like there was perceived to be a conflict as well between communism, and capitalism. And that's one of the implications. Another implication of that is that because it's an ideology, it encompasses everything. There must be an Islamic solution to everything. There must be an Islamic economic system. There must be an Islamic car, as has recently been invented in Malaysia. Everything must be Islamized because it's an ideology that encompasses everything. The second core element that Islamists will share is the notion that the Sharia religious code, which is a personal code of conduct, must become state law. And this is again a modern innovation, alien to traditional Islam. In the history, throughout the history of Muslims, the Sharia was never once adopted as a permanent state codified law. In fact, the whole notion of codified law is modern. But the Islamists will insist that the Sharia religious code must be state law. And if it's not, then the implication is that that state is un-Islamic. The third principle, forgive me for rushing through this, but my time is fast moving down. The third principle is that Islamists will identify with a global community known as the Ummah, and they will consider the Ummah or the Muslim global community as a political identity rather than a religious identity. Again, drawing parallels from communism, this is easily understood when remembering the whole notion of the international proletariat, this global community where workers owe no other allegiance except to fellow workers regardless of borders and ethnicity and nationality. Islamists have developed, again inspired by communism, the same notion of a global political community that owes no allegiance except to itself. And that's the political notion of Ummah rather than the prophetic understanding of Ummah, which is as a religious community. And the Prophet himself in Medina, when he signed the document of Medina, the famous document, used the word Ummah or nation to refer to the Jews, the Christians and the Muslims all living together in one city. Yet today Islamists will use it just for Muslims as a global community. Fourthly, and the final shared element for Islamists is that this ideology, with this law and that global political community needs to be represented by a bloc, like the Soviet bloc. It needs to be represented by an expansionist state, and that is the caliphate. And this state will be expansionist because it represents that global community. And where that state's authority has not extended to look after the affairs of that global community, then it must reach them to liberate them from being enslaved either by the capitalists or the communists. Just like the USSR developed this bloc, and the whole Eastern Bloc was expansionist, and it had the whole notion of exporting the revolution, the Islamists, again inspired by the same ideals, have developed the same paradigm for Islamism. So this global expansionist caliphate is the final shared element that all Islamists believe in. And they've made these four principles fundamental to the creed of Islam. So if somebody, or a Muslim, was to say that I do not believe the Sharia code should become state law, they would consider him a heretic or an apostate. Or if somebody was to say, I do not believe that Islam is a political ideology, they would consider there's something deviant in his creed. They have changed the religion to make the ideology itself the religion.